you have an old saying that my friend Paul McCulley from PIMCO used to say is you don't go to heaven twice for the same deed. Okay, if you want to go to heaven twice, you've got to do two good things. You can't simply use the same one over and over again. We're not going to have the ability to run ridiculously high fiscal deficits. In fact, we're going to have a debt problem in the next 10 to 15 years if we're not careful. You're not going to have the ability to have a positive supply shock like we had on labor. So we are now reliant on these other revolutions that are going on in life sciences, in technology, in sustainable energy to bail us out. If that doesn't happen, then we got to pay for all the growth that we have borrowed from the future.
Prominent CEOs, leading economists, iconic investors, insights from the experts. The Walker Webcast with Willy Walker. See who's next.
To have someone like Mohamed here to speak to us, who is not only a PhD by education, having gone to Cambridge undergrad and gone to Oxford for his master's and for his PhD, but to then have gone to the IMF, to the World Bank, on to Solly Smith Barney for a stint in Europe before going to PIMCO, running PIMCO's emerging markets investments, then leaving PIMCO to go to Harvard University, ran Harvard Management Company, then went back to PIMCO to be co-CEO at PIMCO, to have run PIMCO as successfully as he did, and to now be both the president of King's College, Cambridge, as well as the chief economic advisor to Allianz, which owns PIMCO. Many of you have seen Mohamed on CNBC on a very consistent basis. I have to say, you have a real insider's perspective at the Walker Dunlop conference, given the amount of time that both Mohamed and Barry Sternlicht spend on CNBC. I think you basically have gotten CNBC's perspective on the entire world today and tomorrow. But I have watched Mohamed. I've listened to his insight and thoughts on the economy. And I think one of the things that is hardest for economists to do is not only predict the future, but be consistent to the things that they look for in economic data. And I think one of the hallmarks of Mohamed and why he is so good is that while the data may change, he has a framework with which he processes that data and gives all of us insights to give us a sense about what's coming up. So with that, I will turn the stage over to Mohamed El-Erian.
Thank you, Willy. That was a really nice introduction that I do not deserve. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be with you. I'm going to pick up on a lot of what Willy talked about with two important qualifications. I don't have a single slide that has an animal in it, and I apologize for that. And then, in a strange twist, he has more graphs than I do. But I have something else. I have headlines. So get ready for a bunch of headlines from newspapers. I'm going to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes talking about what's ahead for the global economy and for the US. And if I'm successful, I'm going to leave you with four main takeaways. The first is we've had this very strange period of large forecasting errors, a series of policy mistakes, and pivots in what the Fed tells us. We haven't had a period like this since I've been doing this, and I'm old. Second, forecasting isn't going to get any easier, but the reasons why are evolving. Third, this is why Jerome Powell is so fixated on data dependency. And I'm going to argue that while that's totally understandable, it is problematic. And finally, I'm going to talk about some clear secular trends that you're going to have to navigate. So let's start with a bit of history. August 2022, Jackson Hole, central bankers get together. They're all waiting for Jerome Powell to talk for about 40 minutes and take questions. He gets on the stage, talks for 8 minutes, and leaves, and uses the word pain a few times. the US economy is about to experience significant pain. Why? Because we're having one of the most concentrated interest rate hiking cycles that we've seen since the 80s. So of course we're going to see pain. Of course we're going to see unemployment. Of course we're going to see a recession. 2 months later, Bloomberg Economics comes out and its model predicts 100% probability of a recession in 2023, 100%. They were right about a recession, they just got the wrong country. It happened in the UK, it happened in Japan, it happened in Germany. What happened in the US? Exceptionalism, economic exceptionalism. High growth, declining inflation, buoyant markets. And Willy put up the graph that compares us to other G7 economies. And we've completely outpaced other economies. Now, that was not the only forecasting problem. Inflation also was a problem. 2021, the Fed uses that awful word called transitory. There's nothing more dangerous than the word transitory. Because when you tell somebody something is transitory, you tell them it is temporary, it is reversible, don't worry about it. Look through it. Huge mistake. But that's not the only mistake. The Fed's forecast of inflation has been consistently wrong. In the fourth quarter of last year, we were supposed to be on a disinflationary trend. All that went out the window in the first quarter.
Start a legacy. Start turning dreams into realities. A better world begins with you. Better communities start with us.
So you have growth being a problem to forecast, you have inflation being a problem to forecast, and when you have central banks trying to get over inflation, you get the problem of the last mile. Look at the two middle clippings. They are from the Financial Times. The first one, central banks sent victory over inflation. The second one, the great bet on rate cuts is off. The difference in those two was 30 days. 30 days. We've had the most enormous amounts of Fed policy pivots that we've ever seen. Economists love the notion of forward guidance. Forward guidance means the Fed tells us what they intend to do, and we do the heavy lifting because we believe the Fed. And if we do the heavy lifting, then the Fed, by the time it does what it needs to do, is an orderly adjustment. The problem with forward policy guidance has been totally inconsistent. It's been all over the road. I mean, look at all these headlines. It gives you a sense of how confused the Fed itself has been about what's happening in the economy. I say all this because we now have to go from the past to the future. And you need to answer 4 short-term questions. The first question is the following: will US exceptionalism continue? And that, I will argue, is a function of the Fed. We are starting to see significant weakness in the lower ends of the income for households and in smaller businesses. Tremendous pressure. The only thing that's keeping them going right now is income. They've run down their pandemic savings. They've used up whatever debt capacity they had. Some of the small businesses are having to refinance themselves at significantly higher interest rates, and they're being really squeezed. The question in everybody's mind is this is general weakening, or is this what's called decaying economy? Meaning lower end goes down, upper end goes up, and on average, everything is fine. This is a critical question because the Fed is data dependent. So if the Fed is data dependent, there's a risk that it may not appreciate how much the economy is weakening, and it may be too late in cutting rates. And if it's too late in cutting rates, we go into recession. So the first thing you've got to figure out is, how will the Fed react? The second thing you've got to figure out is, what's going to happen to China and Europe? They're trying to bounce back. They're structurally challenged. And they have a trade-off between short-term stimulus and fixing what ails them. How will they get this right? And I'm going to give you answers for all this in a minute. The third question is what's called the swing states, the middle powers. We don't talk about them much. When someone presents about the global economy, it's the US, China, and it's Europe. But you have a set of middle powers that are becoming systemically important. And they're being squeezed, they're being pulled by China on the one hand and the US on the other hand. How will they respond? This determines things like oil prices, determines all sorts of stuff. And I'm going to argue there's a set of countries, and if you get good at your flags, you see the top ones: India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, UAE, and Brazil, that can play China and the US off. They can live in the in-between. But there's another set of countries, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, Mexico, are going to have to make a choice. And if they don't make the right choice, the global economy gets a lot more complicated. And then the final question has to do with tech, AI. There's a massive competition going on, and there are two poles emerging. How will these poles coexist? If you think these are hard questions that you've got to answer, there's 4 more questions of a longer-term nature you also have to answer. The first one is divergence. We're coming from a period where countries were subject to common shocks and had common policy responses. That was the past. Now, we have countries facing different outlooks, and they have to tailor their policy responses. What Europe needs to do is very different from what the US needs to do. Japan is on a completely different planet, and so is China. And somehow that's got to add up, and it's got to solve. How is that going to solve? The second major question has to do with the economic paradigm. I grew up when life was really simple. It was all about the Washington Consensus. Everybody agreed that in order to have a flourishing economy, a prosperous economy, you need to deregulate, you need to liberalize, and you need fiscal prudence. Those are the 3 elements of the Washington Consensus, and people agreed on them. Look what's happening in Washington today. Deregulation has been replaced by tighter regulation. Liberalization has been replaced by the weaponization of tariffs and the weaponization of investment sanctions. And fiscal prudence has been replaced by fiscal irresponsibility. It was unthinkable before now that you could have 30 straight months of the unemployment rate at 4% or below and have a fiscal deficit of 6 to 7%. It was totally unthinkable. Why? Because as President Kennedy said, you fix the roof when the sun is shining. And when you have unemployment below 4%, the sun is shining. You don't run massive fiscal deficits because you're going to need those fiscal deficits when unemployment goes well above 4%. So we're living in a completely different paradigm, and that's not going to change. No matter who wins the election in November, that is not going to change. We're also living in a completely different international environment. It's no longer about globalization, the ever closer integration of goods, services, and people. It's about fragmentation. Allocating supply chains according to commercial consideration is now subject to nearshoring, friendshoring. This is a different world. This is a world where little pipes are being built around the US. The US stays at the center of the global economy, is simply not as dominant. It cannot inform, influence, or impose outcomes like it used to be before. put it differently, have the image of an orchestra. In the old days, the sheets of music were the same, and everybody listened to the conductor. The global world we live in today, there are different sheets of music, and there's no conductor. That is what's happening to the global economy. And the final issue, which I'm not going to talk about much, but adds to everything I'm going to say, is politics and geopolitics. Remember when President Clinton's speechwriter said, it's the bond markets you've got to worry about. There was a notion that driving the car was economics and markets. And politics and geopolitics and national security were sitting in the back, because economic prosperity meant that all three get better. That's not the world we live in. Economics is lucky to be in the back of the car these days, and it's all about geopolitics, national security, and politics. So think of a world that's being shaken from above, and then think of a world that's being shaken from below. Why is it being shaken from below? Because there's at least 7 sectors going through fundamental change. Technology and generative AI is going to fundamentally change not what we do, but how we do it. Life sciences is going to change a lot of how we live. And sustainable energy, as Willy said, is something that we're going to have to somehow find a way of doing, and doing it in time. And then you have 4 other sectors: defense, healthcare, cybersecurity, and food security, that are going to be very deterministic as well. So you're living in a world that's being shaken from above, you've been living in a world that's being shaken from below, and you've got to predict the future. That's really hard to do. So what does the future look like for me? This is what it looks like. There's a 50% probability that we're going to soft land, meaning we sacrifice some growth, but we bring inflation down. We've only soft landed once before, 1995. There's a 15% probability we do even better. Bigger, but not hotter. Why? We unleash something that Willy talked about, the supply side. We've got to unleash the supply side. And these technological revolutions can unleash the supply side in a meaningful fashion. There's a 15% probability that that comes early. And then there's a 35% probability that we fall into recession. Now, when people see this sort of distribution, it brings out your biases immediately. If you're an optimist, you're going to add 50 plus 15, that's 65. 65, that's going to be okay or even better. If you're a pessimist, you're going to be obsessed by the 35%. 35% of recession, that's really, really high. The reality is you've got to embrace the whole distribution. And that's a really uncomfortable distribution to embrace, because you don't have a dominant outcome. We are wired for dominant outcomes. We are wired for a bell-shaped distribution. Very high likelihood of something happening and very thin tails. You came to Sun Valley because you expected to have this wonderful conference. Now, there was a left tail that it could have been canceled and no one told you. There was a right tail that you could have gotten a really good speaker at the 11 o'clock slot. But you didn't bet on the tails, you bet on the baseline. This is a very flat distribution. This is what is called a multimodal distribution. And this is what you have in the back of your head. You have to embrace the fact that we're looking at a multimodal distribution. So what does it mean? If you don't like distributions, this is the picture. You're on this road, it's windy, you're going to a destination, some different destination, and you've got to navigate all sorts of hazards on the road. That is what the next few years look like. The good news is that the destination is a better one. The bad news is that the journey is a bumpy one. That is what we're facing. Now, how do you do it? Let me tell you how not to do it. We used to live in Southern California, and every 6 months, we would have a daughter-dad outing to Disneyland. And there would be tremendous excitement about we going to Disneyland with my young daughter, who you see here. And she'd want to get to the park as it opened and stay till it shut. Now, if you're living in Southern California, where we were living, Disneyland is about a 30-minute drive with no traffic. But if you want to get there for when the park opens, you've got traffic. So this is what would happen. We would leave the house incredibly excited that we're going to Disneyland. And then we would hit traffic. And I'd be driving and she'd be sitting in the back and I'd hear 100 times, "Are we there yet, Dad? Are we there yet, Dad? Are we there yet?" And I would get irritated. Then it'd stop go, and guess who would get sick in the back of the car? And I would hear, "Dad, I'm going to be sick. Dad, I'm going to be sick." I say, "Open the window. Dad, I'm going to be sick." And then she would be sick. So by the time we would get to Disneyland, the destination didn't matter because we hadn't navigated the journey. So the sequence was we were in love with the destination, we forgot about the journey, and then we couldn't navigate the journey, we forgot about the destination. The lesson is you've got to navigate both. So we know certain things about how you navigate both. The first thing is spare tires. Remember that image? You need some spare tires. You need resilience. Financial and human resilience are absolutely key. You need optionality. You need the open-minded approach that allows you to incorporate a lot of information as you get clarity on all these changes going on. And then you need agility, the courage and the ability to move quickly when there's clarity. The second thing you need to understand is that the other cars on the road are very different from you. They differ in terms of their resilience. They differ in terms of their initial conditions. And if you don't understand the other cars on the road, if you're spending too much time looking in and not enough time looking out, you're either going to get hit or you're going to miss opportunities, one of the two. So this is a world in which you've got to be really keen on what your peers and competitors are doing. The third thing is we're going to have to reskill our employees. AI is a game changer, an absolute game changer. And you're going to have a session on it. I cannot tell you how many sessions I've been on it, and everybody acknowledges it's a game changer, and then they get stuck how to do it. The most important issue in your mind when you talk about AI is what if you grew up AI native in your business? Not as an add-on, but AI native. What will that look like, and how do you get there? And pretty quickly, you start discovering things like if you don't have an AI native person in your executive team, you're not going to get there. Because you've got to think completely different because you're changing how we do things. And then you've got to be open about your blind spots. Blind spots, implicit biases are something that really trip you up when the world is changing. And finally, understand the destination. So I'm going to conclude because Willy asked me to say something about a book that three of us wrote during the pandemic. In about 2016, I got an email from a Gordon Brown. I was in California. I got an email from a Gordon Brown claiming to be the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, saying, "I read your article. I want to come to California to discuss it." So I printed it out and took it to my wife and said, "Who do you think is pulling our leg here?" And she said, "I don't know, but respond to him." So I responded. I said, "I'd love to discuss it. When are you coming?" So he said, "I'm coming on so-and-so." I said, "Great. I will make a reservation and we'll get together for brunch." He said, "If you don't mind, can we meet in your house for security reasons?" So I thought this was going to be a really good test. So he was supposed to come on a Sunday. On the Saturday, the Secret Service, the British Secret Service turns up because prime ministers have protection for the rest of their life. And they start checking the house. And if you want something that makes you feel really insecure, it's those people in the house. Because they say, "You know, that window doesn't shut properly." You know. Anyway, he turns up the next morning. I had not even reread the article, so I couldn't remember what I had written. And he stayed for 6 hours. And then we developed a friendship. Come the pandemic, he decides we should have a call every week during lockdown. And after about 2 calls, I realized I wasn't smart enough to deal with him. So what do? You bring in someone else. So I brought in another friend called Mike Spence, Nobel Prize winner. And for a whole year, the 3 of us would have a call every week. And it was a really depressing call. The vaccines aren't being shared properly. The policymakers don't realize that when you shut down an economy, you can't simply turn it back on by flicking a switch. Things will be in the wrong place. And then we discovered that most of the crises going back 20, 30 years had 3 common elements to it. 1, the inability to grow in a durable, inclusive, and sustainable manner. And you all know, as business leaders, when you don't grow, things go wrong because you can't afford your mistakes. And if you start making mistakes, then you get into what economists call a path dependency, where the likelihood of making another mistake gets higher and higher and higher. The second problem is that policymakers tended to make a lot of mistakes. And this is really important because we're living in a world where the Fed is likely to make another mistake. And they tend to make the same mistake over and over again because they lack cognitive diversity. And then the third element is there wasn't enough cooperation. I say that because your judgment on these 3 factors is going to be important. And I'll leave you with a hopeful note as Willy comes back up that we have answers for all 3. And all we need is political leadership. So I'm going to now sit down and get interviewed. And Willy, I must tell you, after the way Chris did his moderated panel, you are in deep trouble.
I am in deep trouble. I am in deep trouble. First of all, thank you, Mohamed. So I want to get a sense, you, Brown, and Spence on the phone. I mean, like every week. How's that roll with 3 big brains like that?
So there are 2 brains in me. So I don't know if you know Gordon Brown at all, but he is incredibly intense, exhausting. He'll tell you that himself. But really, really committed to public policy. Mike Spence is, the purest economist you can find. Serious, and he's the only Nobel Prize winner I know, and I know 4, that assumes you're smarter than him. So if you tell him something, he'll try to understand why you're saying it. And then my role was to circulate the Zoom link, because I'm the only one who knew how to do it. So we did that. And I have to tell you, so this was incredible. Then we went on a book tour. And Gordon would start. And he feeds off the audience. So he turns into a politician. So I want you to imagine, here's a Nobel Prize winner and myself sitting like potted plants because no one is interested in us at all. Here's Gordon Brown, who starts cracking jokes. We've been with him for 2+ years. We haven't heard a single joke from him. And then suddenly he's cracking jokes. My favorite one was, he tells this story about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's waiting to meet a prime minister from a Nordic country. And the advisor comes in and says, Mr. So-and-so, prime minister of so-and-so is waiting. He's going to see you. And Ronald Reagan goes, I hate communists. And the advisor says, sir, he's a social democrat. He's an anti-communist. And Ronald Reagan responds, I don't care what type of communist he is. I hate them all. So imagine Gordon, okay, and the rest of us just sat there. And it was a humbling experience. But I learned a lot from these 2. They really, really are smart.
Where'd you learn your humility? You're a Cambridge undergrad, Oxford master's and PhD. You've been wildly successful in your business career. Where's the humility come from?
It's funny because I tell my daughters, here's all the things that I didn't do. And I hope that you do things that I did not do. So I don't think myself as I went to a boarding school. I was beaten up every single day in the UK for 2 weeks. Why? Because I had a foreign name. And then I somehow made it to the rugby team. And that allowed me to be embraced, but only after they changed my name. And I remember how happy I was to conform and accept a name that was totally alien to me. But I just wanted to be So I don't think of my life as success. I think my life as a number of challenges. And I'm really glad that Coach Staley said you learn more from your challenges than you do from your successes.
But you're born to Egyptian parents in the United States of America who were here as diplomats. You then moved back to Egypt until you were 10. Then you moved back to the United States. Then you went to boarding school in the UK. Where's the British accent?
Okay, so I went Egypt, US, Paris, and then...
Well, your dad was ambassador to Paris.
And
Egyptian ambassador to Paris.
Correct. And then he is being moved to Switzerland. And I'm 14 years old. I go, Dad, I can't do this anymore. I can't change friends, languages, curriculum. I just can't do it. And he said, where do you want to go? I said, the States, because we had a wonderful time in the States. He said, too far, too expensive. What's your second choice? And without knowing what I was saying, I said, England. He said, you want to go to English boarding school? This is the 70s, by the way. I said, yes. He said, is this your choice? I said, yes. He said, you own it completely? I should have realized he was warning me. I said, yes. He said, no whinging, no whining. Okay, I'm not going to hear you complaining. I said, yes. And I had no idea what I was saying at that time. I remember arriving, the dormitory was as big as this room. There were 52 beds, no heating. The bathrooms were outside. And this was my life for 4 years. And it was quite an experience.
So Cambridge to Oxford.
For all the wrong reasons.
Because?
My final semester, I fell in love with Nikki Marples, this wonderful girl that I thought was my future. And I was supposed to stay in Cambridge to do my doctorate. And I had organized everything. And then she was going to Oxford. And I decided to follow her, which was really hard because I had to first get acceptance at Oxford. I had to change my grant from Cambridge to Oxford. I had to find somewhere to live. And then on the second day we're there, she dumped me.
Really?
Yeah, she totally dumped me.
Where's Nikki Marbles today?
That's what my wife keeps on asking.
You know, there was a number of people in the room were here, Mohamed, years ago when we had Nick Saban come speak. And Nick Saban was telling the story about how he and his wife were high school sweethearts. And they broke up for a very short period of time, and she went off with this one other guy who was from the local town, and they're coming back when they're going to name Nick Saban Way in their hometown in West Virginia. And they're driving by, and the guy that she broke up with him for to date for a small period of time before they came back together had a gas station in the town. And so they're driving along, and he points out to his wife, you know, if you'd ended up with that guy, you'd be still in our little old town in West Virginia and you'd have a gas station. And she goes, no, if I'd married him, he would have already won 5 national championships. It was a good one. So you went to banking, didn't like banking?
So I didn't. When I was at Oxford, my father died. My mother had never worked. And I had a 7-year-old sister. So the optimization process, I'm an economist, became highest possible pay for a PhD economist. And the highest possible pay for a PhD economist were the international organization. So I decided to abandon academia, and I went to the IMF in Washington. And for 15 years, I had the most amazing time learning about policy, because you sat there as a junior person with the ministers of finance and central bank governors talking about what they intended to do and why. So I went there, and then I was turning 40, and I had never tried the private sector. And my human capital was eroding really quickly. And I decided to go from the IMF, an established bureaucracy.
You were deputy director.
I was deputy director, where seniority could be deemed by 2 things in your room: how many lights you had and how many bookshelves you had. Because it was an incredibly bureaucratic. There was time engraved and everything. And I go to the Wild West of Solomon Brothers. And the shock of that transition was incredible. But once again, you know, I adapted. And that's the advantage of being thrown into a boarding school, is you learn to adapt really quickly.
So you went to PIMCO and were at the beginning focused on emerging markets. How'd you avoid the Argentine debt crisis of 2001?
By not knowing what I was doing.
No, I don't buy that.
No. I tell you why. When you join finance late, you haven't drunk all of the Kool-Aid that you drink growing up. So if you manage money, you don't think about it, the benchmark you're managing against becomes your master, because you are being assessed in relative terms. So when I arrived at PIMCO, remember, debt indices, your weight is a function of how much debt you've issued. Argentina was issuing a hell of a lot of debt. So it was 22% of the index. The economists in me, and I wasn't the only one saying it, said the probability of Argentina defaulting is really high. So the economist in me says at the prices that Argentina is trading at, it makes no sense to own any Argentina. So we ran an emerging market fund with 0% Argentina, when most of the other people were, quote, underweight Argentina. And what's a big underweight in the fixed income world? 5 percentage points, which meant they had 17% in Argentina. So the fact that I had grown up in a different world, in the world of fundamentals, when I came to manage money, I wasn't captive to the index, to the benchmark. And if you're managing, as a lot of people here do, single B, triple Cs, if you make a mistake, it's a non-recoverable mistake. Defaults are non-recoverable mistakes. And I would sit on panels and I said, no Argentina. And I would be told that's irresponsible. I'd say, no, it's not irresponsible. Owning 17% of Argentina is irresponsible. So that was the big change. Now, people realize that benchmarks can be quite misleading.
I'm going to come back to Argentina a bit because I want to get your take on how Willy's doing in turning that economy around. And I think one of the interesting things there is your comment about the journey and the destination. I think Willy's been spectacular as it relates to telling the people of Argentina, this is going to be a tough journey. Be ready for this. We have to do this to get to that destination. Whereas, as you say, many people just say, let's go to the destination and forget about the journey. Before we jump to that, when you went to Harvard Management Company, having run emerging markets at PIMCO, you went long emerging markets when you first arrived at Harvard Management. You took, I think, the 6% of the portfolio to 11% of the portfolio in emerging markets. Was that, if you will, a yield grab, in the sense that I've heard you talk, Mohamed, about investing in emerging markets and how the developing world sits there, looks inwardly, like today, where we say we can get great yield locally. And then all of a sudden, when that yield gets taken out, we basically push money out into the emerging markets to try and gain yield because we've taken all the yield out of our own market. Talk for a moment when you got to Harvard Management on why you went so long on emerging markets.
So Harvard Management for me was the ability to do both public and private markets. PIMCO at the time was simply public markets. When you can do private markets, you can get so much better risk reward. I'll give you an example. At the time, if you bought a Pemex bond, the Mexican oil company, it was about 7%. Why? Because a lot of people were being pushed out of advanced economies and into emerging markets just looking for yield. Literally, they were being pushed into it. And as they were being pushed into it, price went up, yield comes down. But if you lend on a private platform to a supplier of Pemex with Pemex receivables as your collateral, you can get paid 10 percentage points more. Why? Because very few people play in that world. So what I discovered is that combination of understanding public markets and then being able to express the view in a much better structured way in private markets is absolutely great. And at the time, we could protect the whole endowment by being willing to give up 25 basis points a year. Why? Because there were certain tranches of CDX trading at ridiculously cheap prices. Because remember 2006 and 2007 beginning, everybody was in love with risk. So you could have that combination whereby you stretch this way and you protect that way. And that worked really well until I left and went back to PIMCO at the end of 2007. And then the temptation at that time volatility had gone up, the protection we had made a lot of money, and the temptation, like any insurance you have, is to take it off when it's making money. And you forget that you put it on because it's insurance. It's like you taking off your car insurance after 6 months because they haven't had a crash. You wouldn't do that. But that's how people think in terms of portfolio insurance. The minute it starts making money, people want to monetize it.
What'd that mistake cost Harvard?
A lot.
Billions.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble is that you then have to liquidate things to get liquidity. Whereas had you kept it, that would have provided you your liquidity. But it's understandable because, whoever comes in wants to do things differently. And if you have something that's made a ton of money, it's very tempting to take it off.
So you think about going from PIMCO to Harvard and your point of being able to make private as well as public investments. What's the best investing seat to sit in? In other words, running Fidelity, running PIMCO, running a hedge fund, running a big family office. I mean, as you sit there as an investor, having been on the public side, the private side, and everything in between, what's the best seat to sit in as an investor?
Let me tell you, the worst seat is the squeezed middle. Okay? You don't want to be in the squeeze. So either you are small, nimble, and have incredible expertise in a particular area, or you're very large and you're almost like a supermarket and you have internal diversification. It's the middle part that's getting increasingly squeezed out. I now advise, quote unquote, a very small 5 billion emerging market boutique, and I'm having the time of my life because you can do a lot of stuff without moving markets. At PIMCO, whenever you wanted to do something, there was always the risk that you're going to move the market against you. I'm trying to do it. We were 2 trillion at the time. So it wasn't easy to get things done. You can live in either end, you just have to think differently. But you don't want to be in the middle. The middle is really getting squeezed right now.
And why are you in academia now? Why'd you go back to King's College and become president of King's College, Cambridge?
So it's Queens.
Queens, excuse me.
So I don't know if I'm going to can I make everybody feel really bad? Can I?
Sure.
2013, it's June. I'm CEO and co-CIO of PIMCO. I asked my daughter, who was 10 at the time, to go brush her teeth. She doesn't do it. I say, go brush your teeth. She doesn't do it. I say, what's the matter? I'm not just your dad, I'm your friend. She says, just a minute, goes to her room and comes back with a folder. Says, Dad, you know that this school year, you've missed 22 of my events. And I said, no way. She opens her folder. On September so-and-so, my first day of school, you went there. My first soccer game, you went there. The first teacher, parent-teacher, you went there. And I started defending myself. Oh yeah, I remember I had to go to Japan. Oh yes, I remember. Then she went and got her yearbook for the previous year. She opened her yearbook on her class. And there was a photo of some exhibition they've had. And there was a picture of me sitting on a stool in the background. And I thought, this is great. Here's evidence that I actually turned up to something. And she said, look at that picture. And I was looking at my BlackBerry at the time, my phone. And she said, Dad, even when you're there, you're not there. The next day, I went to see the founder of PIMCO and said, Bill, in the next 12 months, I'm going to step down. It's up to you. You want me to step down tomorrow? I'll step down tomorrow. You want me to step down in a year's time? But I've got to step down. He said, why? I told him the story. He said, that's bullshit. He said, you're going to go work for a competitor, aren't you? I said, Bill, I'm a New York Mets supporter. I'm a New York Jets supporter. Okay, loyalty is something that I believe in. Okay, otherwise I would have found better teams, believe me. And he said, then you're ill. Do you have cancer? I said, no. And he said, Mohamed, no one walks away from money. And I said, Bill, I don't know my daughter. So I left. And I decided at that time I wouldn't do a full-time job afterwards. So I did what's called a portfolio approach, lots of things. Then comes the opportunity to go back to the college that had totally transformed me. Remember, I came out of boarding school traumatized. And I went to this university expecting that it's all going to start again. And I was transformed completely. I had to transform. I never once felt that I was different, and it unleashed in a real significant way my intellectual curiosity. So the notion of being able to go back, and for 5 years, runs out next year. My wife is very happy about that. But for 5 years that you could do your utmost to make sure that experience is available to more people is something I really wanted to do. And that's why I went back to academia.
Where's your daughter now?
So my daughter's in final year. She's a senior at the University of Pennsylvania. She's still as fiercely independent as she was at the age of 10, which I love. She's working for the summer, and she hated it because she had to take a subway to a train. She had to get up at 5 a.m. till the first paycheck kicked in. And then she said, "Dad, I really understand why people like this finance. I've gotten paid more in one paycheck than I did the whole of last summer." So she was quite happy.
So I now just figured something out when you just said that your daughter's at Penn, which is that being someone who went to Cambridge, went to Oxford, taught at Harvard, ran Harvard Management Company, yet you gave the commencement address at Wharton this past spring, and you called Wharton the best business school in the world.
Correct. That's what the stats say.
Actually, your friend Mike would tell you that Stanford actually, I think, is at the top of the heap right now.
We can debate.
Yeah. It's actually funny that you say that, only because the other day my son and I we got in a car. I had some people over after the Allen and Company conference, and Ted Weschler, who is Warren Buffett's right hand on Berkshire Hathaway Investments, was at my house, and I'm talking about Ted to my son Wyatt, and Wyatt just says to me randomly, "Where'd Mr. Weschler go to college?" And I go, "I don't know, Wyatt. I don't know where he went to college." And he goes, "I bet you he went to Penn." And he goes and he pulls up his iPhone and he goes, he's like, "I told you he went to Penn." So anyway, so talk for a moment as it relates to, you put up a lot of data on where we are from an economic standpoint. You think the Fed cuts in 2 weeks?
I don't. I think they should cut in 2 weeks. And I've been saying that publicly over and over again, but I don't think they will. He's too data dependent. The chair doesn't have a single strategic muscle in him at all. So it's not, and today's retail sales number is going to convince him not to cut. I think.
Why? Because it's too high?
Because it's too strong. It's too strong. It's too strong.
But I hear, and I've listened to you on CNBC time and time again saying they're rearview mirror, they're too data dependent. You actually in that commencement address at Wharton said to everyone in the room, don't be too data dependent in your careers. Like, think about things. Don't just look at the numbers. But haven't they been wildly successful? It's kind of easy to criticize right now, but 2 years ago, everyone was saying, this thing's dunking into a recession. We've gotten through. I put the growth numbers up on us versus the other G7. We've done famously well. Don't they deserve credit for that?
So they've surprised themselves. They didn't think, they have been consistently wrong on GDP growth. They've been too low all along. I go back to 2022 when he warned us of pain. What surprised us is the US economy. The US economy is incredibly resilient. It's incredibly adaptable. That is what surprised us all. He also got a positive supply shock that he never imagined. And I'm not making a political statement, I'm making an economic statement. But you've had 2 million illegal immigrants join the labor force. That's a positive supply shock that has allowed this economy to navigate a lot of the things that other countries have stumbled on. So I think we've collectively been really lucky on this, and let's hope he didn't mess it up. If I was sitting here in 2001 and 21 and told you they've made a mistake about inflation, it's not transitory, they're going to have to hike over 500 basis points in a really concentrated amount of time. They're going to have 4 consecutive 75 basis point hikes. We've never seen that in the history of the Fed, because they were playing massive catch-up. What do you think happens to the economy? I would have told you a recession, like everybody else said a recession. But this economy has surprised us on the upside. So I give them 50% credit, and I give the economy 50% credit, rather than give them 100% credit.
And with that in mind then, is the economy so damn strong that it doesn't make a difference who's running the ship?
You have an old saying that my friend Paul McCulley from PIMCO used to say is you don't go to heaven twice for the same deed. Okay, if you want to go to heaven twice, you've got to do two good things. You can't simply use the same one over and over again. We're not going to have the ability to run ridiculously high fiscal deficits. In fact, we're going to have a debt problem in the next 10 to 15 years if we're not careful. We're not going to have the ability to have a positive supply shock like we had on labor. So we are now reliant on these other revolutions that are going on in life sciences, in technology, in sustainable energy to bail us out. If that doesn't happen, then we got to pay for all the growth that we have borrowed from the future. I look at my girls and I say, my generation blew it. We're leaving you with high debt, high inequality, low growth, and a damaged planet. That is our legacy. That's our inheritance to you. I'm sorry, but the good news is you have tools that we never imagined. And your challenge is to use those tools to deal with the real problems that we're leaving you.
So we've got $33 trillion of US debt. We've got a $27 trillion economy. When do those numbers get to a point where it's super problematic?
When the rest of the world does things better than us. Government bonds solve in relative space. So all you've got to do is be the cleanest dirty shirt. You don't need to be pristine and clean. You need the cleanest dirty shirt. Most of us travel with carry-on. And we pack for the exact amount of time we anticipate to be away. And if, God forbid, we have to extend a day and we can't get to the laundry, we will wear our cleanest dirty shirt. The US is the cleanest dirty shirt in the world. And therefore, we're going to attract other people's capital until they get their act together. So we have time. We're not the UK, where those of you who don't know, there's a prime minister that lasted 40 days because she tried to sprint for growth using unfunded tax cuts. And the markets brought her to her knees, and more importantly, almost demolished the pension system. So we're not there yet. We have a lot more time than others, but if others get their act together, we're going to have a lot less time.
But is the act together in having a currency that becomes the fiat currency, that becomes the reserve currency of the world? Or is it, China's clearly had growth, but we're not sitting around buying their bonds or investing in their currency. Doesn't it have to be that something has to take over the dollar? And if you look at the strength of the dollar and the euro was headed towards that, obviously faltered. As long as we are the reserve currency of the world, we're okay or no?
So we are okay, but we're not as okay as we used to be. For a long time, the argument was you cannot replace something with nothing. And as long as you cannot identify a currency that replaces a dollar, then we're safe. But what we've discovered is China in particular says, I'm not interested in replacing the dollar. I'm interested in building pipes around the dollar. That's a very different approach. And they're fragmenting the system. They have now payments agreement with 50 countries that never deal with the dollar. They have created institutions to compete with the institutions in which the US dominates. So the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the US is not a member of that. And yet it's growing. And then the biggest shock to me personally, but to lots of us, is when we kicked Russia out of the SWIFT system, when we told Russia that you cannot settle in dollars anywhere in the world. We thought that this would bring the Russian economy to its knees. It did not. Because between China, India, Turkey, the UAE, they've created a whole new system. It's very inefficient, but it has allowed Russia to continue functioning without having to deal with the dollar. And there's a lot of countries that are suddenly interested in how do you have a competing system to the dollar. It doesn't have to dominate like the dollar, but it has to help them in case they're on the receiving end of sanctions. So, Willy, what you're seeing is not something replace the dollar, but little pipes being built all around the dollar that reduce the dominance of the dollar. And that's the world we're living in right now.
Is watching, if you will, fund flows. So the Chinese have lowered, I believe, their holdings of US treasuries from like $1.2 trillion down to like 800 billion. something like that. Is that, if you will, a false narrative in the sense of that's not where the real action is and it's actually where you just pointed out?
Yeah, some of it's there, but the trouble is you can't, they're buying a lot of gold, they're trying to divert, but there isn't something to replace the dollar. But it is the completely different architecture that they're building. That is the concern for the US in terms of its dominant role.
And you still sound very bullish on the core US economy.
I am. I think, there's no other economy that I'd rather be in than the US. We have an ability to adapt. We have incredible resources. We have people who react to incentives. Look at this AI. The AI equation is 80-20. Go to Europe, they're obsessed with the 20, the bad things that can happen, totally obsessed. So what do they want to do? They want to regulate it and regulate it and regulate it, and they're going to kill the 80. In the US, we're obsessed with the 80. We forget about the 20. We're just obsessed with the 80. And we're going to make the 80 become 90, and we just have to manage the 10. I just love the attitude that we have.
And you put up 7 sectors that are going through transformations. If you sat there and said, let's just say that you said, I'm going to leave academia, I'm going to go be an investor, I'm going to focus on one place to do like what you did in emerging market debt, for instance, when you went to PIMCO. What of those 7 sectors are you focused on right now?
That's a really tough question. The one that I've spent most time on is what's happening in technology. And when you I just came from a conference, you mentioned OpenAI, there were 2 people there, and they showed us what ChatGPT 5.0 looks like, and it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And then the most scary thing is when they said, I asked them, I was chairing the meeting, what does it look like in 12 months' time? And the response is, we have no idea. Because the 4 things that you need are totally abundant. You need money. And you said it, money is being thrown at them, literally thrown at them. You need data. There's so much data yet that we haven't yet totally captured. You need expertise. There's actually quite a few smart people around. And you need energy. And so far, they haven't hit that constraint. They will, but they haven't hit it yet. So this thing is building momentum at an incredible rate. And it does change. I see what it does to education. It turns education completely upside down. And the places that cannot adjust are going to become irrelevant pretty quickly.
So we're almost out of time. Final thoughts as you look at the outlook for 25, 26, rough GDP growth, where are rates 2 years from now, 10-year?
So rates, I completely agree with what you said, which is that the curve will disinvert. The front end will come down, but don't expect the long end to come down below 4%, 3.5%, 4%. That's the natural rate. We're living in a different world right now. And growth is a big question. And that's why I go back to a combination of resilience, agility, and optionality. And if you are to remember anything, it's the heavyweight fight of the 70s, the rumble in the jungle. Do you remember that or not? You're too young.
I'm not too young. I was around.
Okay, so for those of you who are young, Muhammad Ali, old, exhausted boxer who once floated like a butterfly and stung like a bee, was facing George Foreman, the strongest, most powerful boxer that the world had ever seen. And everybody bet on Foreman. And Ali beat him by knockout in the 8th round. So there's been a ton of academic studies of how that happened. And the bottom line is that the Ali camp realized early on that they're facing a really bad distribution of outcomes. The least likely outcome was that he would win. The second least likely outcome was that he would survive the 12 rounds. And the most likely outcome was that he would be knocked out and injured really badly. So what did they do? They worked on changing that distribution. And they did 2 things. The training became hiring former convict that spent 3 hours every single day beating up on Ali. And they were building his resilience. And then when the fight starts, and you can see it on YouTube, everybody expected Ali to stay in the middle of the ring and not get trapped. Instead, Ali goes to the ropes and bends back. And what they had invented was the rope-a-dope. The notion of using the ropes, the flexibility of the ropes to dissipate the blows. For 7 rounds, he relied on resilience that they had built up. In the 8th round, Foreman got tired, and Ali had the optionality and the agility to knock him out. And that is the one story that you should take away, that if you're going to navigate this, you've got to get control of your distributions, because these are not good distributions to operate to, because they're multimodal. And that is the one thing, is that when it comes to growth, I don't know what it's going to look like. I know it can be really good. And I also know that if we make a policy mistakes, we're going to slip into recession pretty quickly. And then we're not going to be worried about interest rate risk, which is what we're worried about right now. We're going to be worried about credit risk. And that is not something we want to worry about.
I'm trying to figure out now whether you're on the 65% or on the 35%.
I embrace the whole distribution.
You can't say that. You can't say that.
No, I think you've got to embrace the whole distribution, because if you focus too much on one end or the other, you're going to be laser focused so much that you're going to forget that things can change. I go again. If I had told you that we're going to hike by over 500 basis points, would you have bet on a recession? I would have.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. A lot of people bet on my 11 o'clock discussion being a great one, and we got just that. Ladies and gentlemen, Mohamed El-Erian.